Plenary Session 1 will focus on the theme of South Asian states. The session will be moderated by Dr. Iftekhar Ahmed Chowdhury, Principal Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Chowdhury has a PhD and an MA in International Relations from the Australian National University, Canberra. He has been a prolific writer on issues pertaining to multilateral diplomacy and contributes regularly to leading journals and the media. Dr. Chowdhury was the Foreign Minister of Bangladesh from 2007 to 2009. During his 4 decades of public service, he has served as an ambassador and the permanent representative to the UN in New York and Geneva. I would now like to invite Dr. Chowdhury and the following panel speakers on stage. Professor Niaz Ahmed Khan, Professor and Chairman of the Department of Development Studies at the University of Dhaka, Bangladesh. Professor Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, Associate Professor, Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad, and Visiting Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS. And finally, Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, Senior Lecturer at the Department of Social Sciences, the Open University of Sri Lanka. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please give them a round of applause, please? Thank you. I will now hand over the session to our esteemed moderator, Dr. Iftekhar Ahmed Chowdhury.
Well, thanks to Jayanth for getting us together back again, and we will seamlessly, I hope, flow into the next event of the conference, Plenary Session 1. We've had a most stimulating beginning to our conference, the discussion on India, led by Professor Pratap Vanu Mehta. In this session, we shall turn our focus on the 3 other important South Asian countries: Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. It's an enormous delight for us that we have 3 very distinguished panelists, each of prodigious intellectual paths, to speak to us on this occasion. One on each of the topics. We have Professor Niaz Ahmed Khan, Chairman of the Department of Development Studies, University of Dhaka. Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, Visiting Research Fellow with us at ISAS and also Associate Professor, Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad. And we have Dr. Harini Amarasuriya, Senior Lecturer, Department of Social Sciences, Open University of Sri Lanka. Their detailed bio notes are available in the brochure that we have circulated. I would bid each one of them welcome, as I do you all. Each of the speakers will have 15 minutes each, which, as you would appreciate, a la Singapore style is kept rather strictly here. And we have timekeepers who are annoyingly efficient, following which I shall open the floor for a half-hour interactive Q&A session. I shall first call upon Professor Niaz Ahmed Khan to speak, and his theme will be Reckoning Trends in Decentralized Local Governance in Bangladesh. His study, unquestionably relevant to Bangladesh at these times, is mainly based on a desk review including examination of records and documents, key literature, and personal observations and insights. He will seek to identify and explore the trends and limitations. And it is with much pleasure that I pass on the microphone to him.
Friends and colleagues, I'll try to be as brief as possible. I have no intention to tax on your patience. The way I have organized this discussion is that we begin with just a quick overview of the Bangladeshi pattern of local governance, the institutional part of it, and then we quickly move on to the core of today's discussion, some identification of the major trends and characteristics of local governance in the country. And then we try to have some form of a visualization of a real life case where I would show you, if time allows, just a quick video clip on one of the relatively better performing local governance projects in the country. So these are the 3 episodes that I hope to cover in the next 15 minutes or so. And thank you, Chair, for having me here and the organizers. Now, this is how the local governance structure looks like in Bangladesh. The left column would be the local governance institutions within the broader sub-national administrative framework. Now, as we all know, we share much of our legacy and history with India, and it's always good to have some friends from India so that we can learn from each other, and this interaction, I feel, is vital. We have a history of local government actually going back to more than 200 years, even in the institutional form. So it's quite rich, but in terms of the actual performance, which we'll discuss in another 2 to 3 minutes' time. So the legacy is rich, but the performance remains, and it's up to you to then decide. I'll show you some of the highlights of the performance. Now, this is the slight elaboration of the left part of the last slide. This is how the local governance structure now looks like. We have got 3 broad streams. The local governments for the spatial area, and by this we mean the Chittagong Hill Tracts, the Hill Tracts region in the northeast. And then we've got the rural local governance and urban local governance. These are very similar to the other parts of the subcontinent. Now, in terms of the trends, there are many. And in the main paper, I've tried to highlight some of the more compelling trends which are in fact shaping the actual delivery of democracy through local governance. Because we have got very little time here, so I'll be selective on this and just focus on, let's say, in the next 5 minutes or so, we'll be focusing on, let's say, 5 to 6 of these trends. Now, in any case, much of these trends are common sense for everybody to actually see, even with some nodding acquaintance with the Bangladesh situation. I'm sure most of you are aware of this. So in this sense, this is more or less a recapitulation of some of the underlying trends, but these are always important to look back into because they actually shape the course of action in the future. Now, the first point is, and this is the most historical one, no change over the last 200 years or so, the point about that most of our local governance and decentralization policies have actually served to perpetuate power and authority of the central political regimes. Now, that remains the most strong trend over the course of the history, especially in Bangladesh. And successive ruling regimes have used this trend to their benefit. This mainly involves creating and state sponsorship of promoting a group of socio-economic elites who actually serve as vote banks at the subnational level. That's the core result coming out of this trend. Now, related to this one, the next one is about the fact that hardly any government actually showed the political will to do something at a more substantial level, at a more basic level, in terms of reforming local governance. Now, the next trend, which is particularly important for Bangladesh now, after many years, we now have a degree of regularity in holding elections. So you have these more or less regular elections now. And you hope that this will create the much needed political space at the subnational level. And then you see a corresponding trend of actually appropriation and usurpation of this space by the central political parties. And now you see that actually the parliament is almost on a day-to-day basis present in Bangladesh local governance scenario. And I'll come to that with some specific examples. The next two, inadequate capacity and the lack of continuity. Capacity problem, more or less, this has been the case all these years, and we are all aware of this. But the one that I want to highlight is the problem of lack of continuity of policy and practice. Today, we are very fortunate to have one of the most distinguished Bangladeshi practitioner academic as our chair, Dr. Iftekhar, who was, in fact, one of the leading personalities during the 2007-9 caretaker government. Just to cite this example, the caretaker government actually introduced a set of reforms quite substantial in nature in Bangladesh, including, for example, promulgation of a set of ordinances and regulations which were much needed, and there were all sorts of compelling reasons for actually doing so, but it was only the caretaker government who actually dared getting into this relatively delicate areas of reform. And they also established, again, a much needed local, independent local government commission, the National Local Government Commission. Now, after the return of Sheikh Hasina's government, the regular politically elected government, most of these reform efforts were either completely ditched or substantially changed. For example, the local government commission has been dissolved. The umbrella law, they used to call, which basically provides a unifying framework for all major urban local government policies and regulations, has been ditched. And now the government has in fact revived the 1998, I don't want to get into too much details of the technicalities of this ordinance, but just to mention this one, we have got this Upojela sub-district ordinance, which is very important as a local government tier. And the government has now revised the Upojela ordinance, and this was done in 2009, so that, 2011, my mistake, so that MPs now, the national members of parliaments, have a direct role on the day-to-day operation of Upojela as an advisor. They are in fact physically present. They have an earmarked office within the sub-district administration, and we've got about 460 sub-districts now. And then I'll just move on to the next set of these strands. Bureaucratic domination, I don't have to discuss this, very common with most of the other South Asian examples. The gap between policy rhetoric and reality, just one quick example. Our constitution provides for very specific clauses and provisions of local governments. I'll just cite one. The clause 59 of the Constitution actually says this, that the government will commit local government in every administrative unit of the Republic, and these shall be entrusted to bodies composed of persons elected in accordance with the law. So you actually see a direct provision coming from the highest law of the country, the Constitution, that you need to have politically elected leadership in every tier of the local government system. But as I said, nearly all but one tiers of the local government system remain non-elected. The latest example being and this is from Dhaka, so you know, most of you have personal experience of actually seeing Dhaka. So the Dhaka City Corporation, we now have an arbitrary division of the city corporation into two parts, north and south, completely arbitrarily done by immediately after the end of the caretaker government, by the new government. And then we now have pending elections, pending since 2007. And the government has actually picked up with known political leanings, bureaucrats to run as administrators of these highly important and nationally significant urban local government bodies. Just one example. No elections at the district level, highly controversial elections at the Upazila level, especially from the third round. We had got these 5 rounds of election from the third round onwards. And then the other points, much of this, as I said, are quite well known. The problem of inadequate resource mobilization. The way things work is that we have block grants moving into the local government. And that remains from the central government. That remains the core of local government funding. In terms of mobilizing resources at the local level, there are many reasons. And this is not happening as the way you would expect it to be, mainly because of the reluctance of the local political leadership to impose or go for serious taxation or the loss of popularity. That's the main reason. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, but very little capacity at the union level to actually manage financial and administrative management. On the positive side, we now have, this is the point, the last point here, we now have actually substantial development projects centrally managed and funded, but done at the local level. Now, this actually creates an opportunity for the local government, if you can actually use it right, for the local government to directly benefit from. If they can have a degree of control over these resources. Just to cite an example of the financial volume. Bangladesh every year spends about 24,000 crores of taka every year on social safety net programs. And about 46% of this money goes directly to the union level. Now, if we could have a way to actually empower the unions to take charge of this development work, this would make a big difference. Now, I'll stop here and actually show you a quick video because I feel, and just before the video, just a quick few cartoons that have come out in the newspaper. But before you go to the cartoon, this is, although a discussion about local government, but this is the building which shapes everything about local government in the country.
In about 5 minutes, though.
Yeah, I'll just stop now. Anyway, so these are some of the photographs that I just wanted to quickly show coming out in the local newspapers. Okay, now, Chair, if you allow me just 5 more minutes, clues on improvement, I'll not discuss this because remember how many times you have sat in this type of workshops and given all the recommendations and nobody to actually listen to. So I'll just stop there. And I'll actually show you a quick video because this is something that I really want to highlight the point that not everything is hopeless. There are pockets of success, there are pioneering cases. My friend, yes, please, yes.
This is modern-day Sirajganj, where a $9 million UN project to fight poverty by revitalizing the local government is proving to be a successful experiment. It is a joint effort by the UN Capital Development Fund and the UN Development Programme. Since it started in the year 2000, it has shown that the union porishods, the local government branches, can function efficiently, that people are willing to participate in decisions affecting their lives, and that trust can exist between communities and their local representatives. The project's first priority was to train Union Porishad members to run functional offices, to form committees, and to manage and monitor projects. Most importantly, they learned how to establish a system of dialogue with their communities. The response was immediate.
তারা এখানে বসে থেকে যে ওই রাস্তা আমার গ্রামের পাশে একটা রাস্তা বসে থেকে এই রাস্তা মেম্বারের রুচিমতো চেয়ারম্যানের রুচিমতো যে ওই এলাকা একটা রাস্তা আছে ওই রাস্তা আমরা জনগণের প্রয়োজন কি ভালো মন্দ এটা দেখতো না ডাকিয়ে যে আমরা যেমন ডাকিয়ে পিয়ারে করছি যেমন জন অংশগ্রহণ জনগণ যেমন মতামত দিছে যে আমাদের এই রাস্তা দরকার কিংবা আবার সব গ্রাম থেকে একজন মহিলা দুইজন পুরুষ নিয়ে আমরা ভোটার নিযুক্ত করছি তারা ভোট দিছে যে রাস্তায় ভোট বেশি পাইছে ওই রাস্তা ফার্স্ট সেকেন্ড থার্ড এরকম ভাবে হচ্ছে আগে তা করে নাই আগে তারা একা একাই দিছে রাস্তা এইবার মেম্বার চেয়ারম্যান তারাই
Once the training was completed, UNCDF released 20 million taka directly to these union porishads for 500 small schemes identified and overseen by the communities. These small schemes can go a long way to improve people's lives. This simple water drainage system in a local market, for example, means that the market can function even during heavy rains. Tube wells have also been installed throughout the district. Village tracks now allow people to move safely between their homes, their markets, the schools and dispensaries. They cost less than 30,000 taka and the community will look after their repair.
যাদের দরকার আশেপাশে ওরাই সাহায্য করলো, যার যার দরকার মাটির কোনো সমস্যা হয় না আপা, কারণ যে ওদের দরকারের জন্য ওরা রাস্তা নিছে, সমস্যা কেমনে করবে।
The spirit of the Sirajganj project is dialogue and participation. The sight of men and women going in and out of their UP office is becoming more and more common in Sirajganj. A new political culture is developing, one that is more interactive, more responsive to the voices of the people. A popular figure here, Khurshid Alam was a freedom fighter and is now an elected UP chairman.
সীমিত সামর্থ্য নিয়ে যা করা দরকার সেটুকু আমরা করতেছি, আর কিছু করতে না পারলেও একটা কাজ করতেছি, সেটা হলো ওদেরকে আমরা সকল কাজকে জানা দিতেছি, তোমাদের এই অধিকার আছে, তোমরা এটুকু কিন্তু পাচ্ছ না, এটুকু তোমরা জানো, এদের সরকারকে বলো, যে কোনো ফর্ম থেকে তোমরা বলতে পারো আর কি, এই জন্য জানা তো দিতে পারছি, এইটা আমার সার্থকতা আর কি। আর যদি আমি ইউনিয়ন পরিষদের চেয়ারম্যান না হইতাম, আমি তো জনগণের কাছে যাওয়ার এই সুযোগটাও পেতাম না, এই সুযোগটা ওরা করে দিয়েছে, আমার কাজটা আমি করছি।
In this men's world, hardly women's view is taken into consideration. But now with the directly elected women members, the project has inbuilt in it that 30% of all schemes to be identified by the women. So naturally, when they identify the project, they see that their interest is being taken care of.
One of the successes of the Sirajganj project is the decrease in the school dropout rate. In the last few years, more and more children who go to school stay at school because parents support teachers and make their children's education a priority.
ইউনিয়ন পরিষদই তৃণমূল জায়গা, যেখানে শিক্ষা বিষয়টাকে সে সর্বসময় মনিটরিং করতে পারে, শিক্ষক আসলো কিনা, পড়াশোনা করাইলো কিনা, ছাত্র আসলো কিনা। আপনার ভালো মনে আছে যে এর আগে উপজেলা পরিষদ ছিল, উপজেলা পরিষদ উল্লাপাড়াতে যখন ছিল, উল্লাপাড়ায় এই শিক্ষক মহোদয়রা সেই উপজেলার উপরে নষ্ট ছিল, ঠিকমতো ক্লাস না হলে আমরা তাদেরকে বলতে পারতাম, পানিশমেন্ট দিতে পারতাম, দূরিয়ে দিতে পারতাম, আবার সবসময় মনিটরিং করতে পারতাম। এই তখনকার সেই শিক্ষা ব্যবস্থাটা এই উপজেলা পরিষদের সময়, সেই সিস্টেম যদি আবার কখনো করা যায়।
Budget meetings are also open affairs. Information about available funds, plans and accounts are all put on the table for everyone to see and ask questions. The Sirajganj project has gathered momentum and has attracted initiatives by local NGOs and cultural groups in support of the project's philosophy. They provide platforms to discuss various issues, such as the role of union porishads, the environment, and health issues. In a light-hearted way, cultural shows also address sensitive topics, such as child marriage and women's rights. The challenge now is to transfer and adapt the Sirajganj lessons to places with different resources and different conditions.
I think the Sirajganj experience shows us democracy works. You challenge people, you give them a chance to participate, and they do.
As for Sirajganj, it may take a while for it to return to its former glory, but for the moment it is on its way to recovery because 2.5 million people have found their voice again.
That the more centralized a political system is, whether that facilitates decentralization in some ways of the system administratively and fiscally. Anyway, next on my list of speakers is we have Professor Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, he's titled his presentation, More Equal Than Others, Punjab, Army, Federalism, and Democracy in Pakistan. Pakistan, incidentally, is a country where, one of those, probably the only modern country where an ethnic majority seceded, and this is as early as 1971 with the nations of Bangladesh. And thereafter it has had to struggle to establish a durable federal structure with the four provinces, Punjab, Balochistan, Sindh, and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. This is a challenge that contemporary Pakistan is having to confront, and this is what Professor Aasim Sajjad Akhtar is going to speak to. I'll give him the floor now, but not before I recognize and acknowledge the presence here of Ambassador Tanveer Khashkheli, High Commissioner of Pakistan. Thank you and welcome, High Commissioner, and thank you for being with us.
Sorry, folks, no PowerPoint presentation. Old-fashioned academic, and you will have to bear with me. It's rare, I guess, in the contemporary period to actually be invited to speak about Pakistan and not have to speak about terrorism. So that is a pleasant beginning. It is, however, difficult to undertake any serious analysis of Pakistan's political economy without mention of its ever-present army. And where there is an army, especially one with political aspirations, democracy and federalism become a much more challenging prospect. I think in the introduction to the keynote, Professor Tan mentioned whether Indian democracy would be where it is today if there weren't successive regimes having facilitated the development of more and more states. I think Pakistan is an exclusive company where we started off with 5 provinces and now we have 4, which gives you a sense of just how successful our federal nation-building project has been. But the roots of the problem actually precede even the Pakistani state. In fact, Professor Tan Tayong, before him, many others, Clive Dewey, Imran Ali, have all shown that military power in post-colonial Pakistan and the predominantly Punjabi character of the military can be explained in large part by the unique social contract established in colonial Punjab from the early decades of the 20th century. Not only did Punjabis dominate the British Indian Army numerically from at least the First World War onwards, the so-called Punjab School of Administration also featured a significant military component. Meanwhile, the military or military personnel were also thoroughly integrated into the socio-economic structures progressively established from the later decades of the 19th century, in the form of dozens of cantonments littered across the entire province, and land grants to military personnel in the so-called canal colonies, which remains one of the biggest perennial irrigation schemes in the world, and in which large numbers of grants are often given to retired civil and particularly military personnel. Thus, by 1947, Punjab and its military had become a major political and economic player in India. As you know, Punjab was also the so-called granary of the subcontinent. And by virtue of the partition agreement, it was Pakistan that inherited this behemoth, for lack of a better word. Of course, history doesn't play out according to a predetermined script. Many contingencies played out in the military's subsequent emergence as the country's most powerful political force. Yet there's no denying that the sociological roots of the military's power had been established long before the first military coup of 1958. Indeed, the military's heartland of Punjab emerged as the country's most powerful province soon after partition itself, and the country's constituent assembly was internally conflicted from the very outset. East Bengal, or erstwhile East Pakistan, and Punjab emerging as the 2 major competing entities within the fledgling federation. By 1951, East Bengal, which actually had been arguably the stronghold of the Muslim League, of the All India Muslim League in the years leading up to partition, had revolted against that very party, and soon became the bastion of anti-establishment politics, regularly protesting against the anti-democratic machinations of the Punjabi military and, on the other hand, a predominantly Urdu-speaking bureaucracy. I apologize for the brief history lesson, but this is how it goes with an old-fashioned academic. The lack of consensus over the constitution, the non-holding of elections, the forcible dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, and the eventual formation of the so-called one unit, a barely disguised attempt to counter East Pakistan's demographic majority, confirmed that the Punjabi and Urdu-speaking establishment was none too concerned with the niceties of either democracy or federalism. When elections were finally held some 24 years later, and the expected Bengali majority came to pass, the establishment was frankly having none of it. An army action, and 9 months later, Pakistan became the first, as Professor Chowdhury just pointed out, and to date only modern nation state to experience secession by an ethnic majority. Sadly, in subsequent decades, we really haven't seemed to learn the lesson. The anti-democratic and unitary impulses of the army have continued to shape the polity, with the tacit support, importantly, of a cross-section of Punjabi society and its political representatives. Most notable have been army actions against Baloch populations in the 1970s, and then again over the last decade. Again, army actions against the Sindh-based movement for restoration of democracy during the Zia regime in the 1980s, and less known, often not really advertised, target killings of hundreds of Pashtun nationalists just over the last, well, until 2013, even while a Pashtun nationalist party was in power in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the Awami National Party. More generally, Punjab's domination of the polity has been sustained electorally by virtue of its demographic majority. And this is actually an interesting sort of indicator of how selectively political slogans can be raised, because those of you who know will remember that until 1971, there was a hullabaloo about the notion that the majority population should get most of the resources. But all of a sudden, when the majority of the population seceded, Punjab decided to change its mind and strictly adhered to this notion that the National Finance Award, which has recently been renegotiated, should be allocated purely on the basis of population. There is, however, in spite of all of this, a suggestion on the civilian side of this equation, if not on the military one, that recognition has dawned within Punjab and amongst mainstream political parties more generally that meaningful democratization and establishment of a genuinely federal polity are imperative if the virtually abortive Pakistani nation-building project is to turn over a new leaf. This cautious optimism has its roots firstly in the so-called Charter of Democracy signed between the country's two biggest political parties in 2006, when both leaders of these parties were in exile, Nawaz Sharif and Benazir Bhutto. Now, this is interesting if for no other reason that the PML, Nawaz Sharif's party, as you know, the party currently in power, has historically basically been, as we'd say in Urdu, a baghal bacha of the Punjabi establishment. Again, those of you who know Pakistan will know that Mian Sharif, or Baba Sharif, Nawaz Sharif's dad, who ran what was at that point a relatively moderate steel foundry called Iftekhar, had his steel factories nationalized by Bhutto, which then Ziaul Haq proceeded to denationalize and also handpicked Nawaz Sharif as Punjab's finance minister in 1981, elevating him to the position of Chief Minister of Punjab in 1985. So there is a very close link between this party and the military. So the fact that this party, along with the People's Party, which of course has a different history and genesis, the fact that these two parties would come together and over the period of 1988 to 1999, when they alternated in power, they were much more prone to actually be at each other's throats. So the fact that there was an element of perhaps them having matured and coming together, signing a charter of democracy, which explicitly said we will forever banish the military to its barracks, was, ostensibly an important development in the story of the rather checkered story of Pakistani democracy. This process of maturation and consensus building arguably culminated during the previous regime's tenure, which was Pakistan People's Party's regime's tenure, when the parliament, in which the two parties, the People's Party and the Muslim League, were the two bigger players, passed the 18th Constitutional Amendment, which not only reversed many of the anti-democratic legal manipulations of early military dictators, but also decreed a dramatic reduction in the powers of central government in favor of the provinces. Now, in 1973, which is when the Pakistani Constitution, in its current version, inclusive of all of these amendments, was passed, there was, right prior to that actual legislation, there was a constitutional accord in which it was agreed that there was going to be a concurrent list. And the concurrent list was supposed to be phased out. The concurrent list, i.e. a sharing of powers between the center and the provinces. The concurrent list, according to the Constitutional Accord, was to have been phased out within the space of about a decade. Needless to say, that never happened. In part because, of course, democratic and constitutional rule was suspended shortly thereafter in 1977. So the passing of the 18th Constitutional Amendment, in which the concurrent list was finally abolished, and the vast majority of executive powers were passed over to the provinces, was, if nothing else but on paper, was a significant development. Now, of course, the critics, and there have been many, point to the numerous teething problems of the 18th Amendment. In particular, and this is a common refrain in Pakistan on a number of fronts, in particular the fact that the province were not equipped, did not have the capacity to deal with, for example, the fact that a number of federal ministries were actually just dissolved. And all of those powers and responsibilities were passed on directly to the provinces. And there is a perception that they simply were not equipped and did not have the capacity to do this. But then, this is also a country in which the army does everything from making cement to cereal, and then people say, well, they do it better than others because they don't let anybody else try. So this is sort of, I take that criticism of the teething problems in the same spirit. However, unfortunately, those teething problems actually pale in comparison to the much more serious questions of whether or not these constitutional efforts of these mainstream parties actually meant very much at all. How legitimate were they, given that there have been historically, and over this particular period, let's say the last 10 years, there have been a very significant number of political players in these historically deprived provinces, the non-Punjabi provinces, who have actually explicitly said they want to have nothing to do with the mainstream political process, including the parliament and the constitution. This is most acutely the case in Balochistan, which is sort of Pakistan's hidden war, right? It's the war that nobody hears about. We hear all about the war on terror, but not the ongoing war in Balochistan, which has experienced at least 5 different varying levels of insurgency since partition, the most recent of which has been ongoing since 2004. This would perhaps just be an unproblematic history of conflict or continuing conflict, but for the fact that, sadly, state repression actually appears to have become more pronounced in the contemporary period. Most notably, hundreds, if not thousands, and there are various estimates about this, different organizations have postulated different estimates, but hundreds, if not thousands, of Baloch political activists, and particularly students, have been disappeared over the past decade, many of whose mutilated bodies are later dumped in public places. Over the past year or so, similar reports have started to emerge from Sindh, albeit with much less frequency. These extrajudicial kidnappings and killings are both cause and consequence of anti-state sentiments of a growing cross-section of whether it be Baloch or Sindhi society. As such, therefore, the constitutional initiatives taken during the PPP regime of 2008 to 2013 are, for many Baloch, considered an eyewash, who clearly cannot reconcile the nominally federal, or attempts to develop this nominally federal structure with the increasing militarization and centralization of power in their own province. And I'll give you an anecdote about the post-disaster relief efforts that were undertaken in a district called Avaran in Balochistan after an earthquake that took place there early last year. The chief minister of Balochistan, who hails from this party called the National Party, his name is Dr. Abdul Malik Baloch, about 4 or 5 days after the earthquake, held a press conference in Quetta, which is the provincial capital of Balochistan, requesting, and please note this is the chief minister, requesting that foreign aid workers be allowed into the province to assist with the relief work. Now, who exactly Dr. Malik was requesting and why the supposedly by law, the man with the greatest executive power in the province had to make such a request, I leave to your imagination. There is, however, some silver lining in this developing narrative, which brings me to what is occupying probably some of you and most of the Pakistani media and intelligentsia these days, not to mention the political elite, that phenomenon we call Imran Khan. So Mr. Khan has been waging an apparently principled struggle against corruption and for the rule of law over the past few months. His sit-ins outside the Parliament building is now 3 months old and counting. His principal target? Well, Nawaz Sharif and the ruling PML, which, as I noted earlier, is a Punjab-based party with historical ties to the military establishment. Since 1999, however, when the military overthrew Sharif in a coup, there has been, as I suggested with the Charter of Democracy and its support to the constitutional amendment, there's been a shift in the PML's posture, at least on the surface. I don't want to overstate the case, God forbid that I overstate the case, but it is in any case true that political alignments, especially in a country like Pakistan, rarely remain static. So what I want to suggest is, while historically political tussles for power have pitted Punjab as a relative monolith against the other provinces, the ongoing confrontation between the PTI of Imran Khan and the PML is effectively for control over Punjab. That is to say that arguably for the first time in the country's history, Punjab is, so to speak, at war with itself, not of course the kind of war that's going on in the Pashtun or Baloch areas, which suggests that the army is no longer able to count on the unified support of its Punjabi heartland, at least to the extent that it did until relatively recently. And again, whether it's conjecture or otherwise, if it's actually no longer conjecture, if it ever was, about 3 days ago, Mr. Khan stood up in front of a public rally and said, I want a judicial commission to be constituted to look into all of these allegations of corruption and electoral malpractice. And this judicial commission should be comprised of high-ranking members of the ISI and the military intelligence. So I wonder where he got that idea. So the same Nawaz Sharif, Baghal Bacha of the army, apparently isn't in the army's good books anymore. Now, that could be true, it could be false, but either way, given that the PMLN is the biggest party in Punjab and pretty much won the entire country on account of Punjab's demographic majority just by winning in Punjab, it would be fair to say that the cat is truly amongst the pigeons. Of course, simply the fact that there are emergent contradictions within the Punjab and military-centric structure of power doesn't guarantee that federalism and democracy have a bright future. This is in large part because the political inclinations of a significant cross-section of Punjabi society, which is increasingly upwardly mobile, integrated into the global economy, and not necessarily federalist in its thinking about Pakistan. Because if society itself is not necessarily inclined to restructure, then there's no reason to think that an internal conflict between the political elite will lead to restructuring. Indeed, it's still not, unfortunately, possible to rule out even in direct military intervention even now, which would necessarily put further strains on an already fragile federation. And even without direct intervention, I just suggested that recent events in Islamabad had confirmed that the military will continue to project its monopoly claims through covert means. Perhaps most importantly, and this is sort of the point, so long as the military directly controls and is effectively de facto controlling provinces such as Balochistan, and crucially uses unbridled force in this regard, democracy of more than the formal kind and federalism will remain a pipe dream. And many non-Punjabis, which unfortunately is the case today, will continue to conceive of Pakistan as a colonial entity hell-bent on keeping them enslaved. And we all know, as we started off with 1971, where that story ends. So I will stop there.
His incredible capacity to be profound, stimulating, and also provocative at the same time. We will wait for reactions, wait for the Q&A for the reactions. And right now it would be my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Harini Amarasuriya. Sri Lanka has known a bloody domestic war between the regional armed forces and national armed forces and the LTTE that concluded in May 2009. And since then, the government, on numerous occasions, has reiterated the need to catch up on the lost times. This has not been rendered easy, as will be explained by our next panelist. She will examine the burgeoning dissent within the civil society and the community that have been standing in the way. And also Colombo's attempts to navigate the course through these rough waters. Her subject is post-war development state in Sri Lanka, multiple narratives and emerging contradictions. I invite you to move to the rest.
Things in Sri Lanka are unfolding so fast that my title had to change to keep up. And so it's not what it's actually published in the brochure. My title is now Power, Development Rituals and Politics, the Political Elite in Sri Lanka. So if anyone's halfway interested in what's happening in Sri Lanka right now, I'm sure you would have heard about the fact that there are rumors of a presidential election called 2 years ahead of time. And also that there's an ongoing debate about whether the current president, President Rajapaksa, is actually allowed to contest for a third term. He brought in an 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 2010, which removed the restriction for two-term restriction which existed. But there are certain people within the legal community who've argued that this amendment does not apply to President Rajapaksa, that it cannot be applied retrospectively, it is only for future presidents. So there has been this sort of huge debate whether he can actually even contest for a third time. And just before I left, the president had asked for an opinion of the Supreme Court, and I just saw in the news today that the Supreme Court predictably had said, yes, he can go for a third term. So for many years now, there has been sort of a growing calls for the abolition of the presidential system, funnily enough. In 1994, President Rajapaksa's predecessor, President Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga, came into power on a manifesto that promised to abolish the presidency within 1 year. However, her attempt to do so in 2000, during her second term, was defeated by the opposition, the United National Party, the UNP, which was actually responsible in 1978 for bringing in the presidential system. When President Rajapaksa himself campaigned for his first term in 2005, he too came in on an election manifesto that promised to abolish the presidency. Today, almost all the opposition parties have unanimously agreed that the presidential system needs to at least be reformed, including the UNP have now said that it needs to be reformed or at least abolished. And there are even parties within the ruling alliance which have also expressed support for the abolishing or at least reforming of the presidential system. So the question that I'm asking in my paper is, what exactly do these debates about the presidential system reveal about state-society relations in Sri Lanka, the political elite, and the nature of Sri Lanka's polity? When we consider how Sri Lanka has been perceived by the world, most often, for Pakistan, it's terrorism, for Sri Lanka, it's ethnicity and violence. So that, and also this sort of notion, the narrative of Sri Lanka, there's this very prominent feature in it that Sri Lanka failed to live up to its potential. It was considered a pioneer during the colonial period in the development of representative institutions. At the time of independence, the economy was doing well, the political reforms and transition to independence was smooth, there was an educated and healthy population, ready to take on independence. In fact, Singapore's former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, who had apparently visited Sri Lanka in 1956, is often quoted in this narrative as saying at that time Sri Lanka was better than Singapore. So this phrase is often recalled now to compare the two countries and Sri Lanka's decline compared to Singapore. During the 1950s, slum communities in Colombo were referred to as Koreas. Yet today, thousands of youth are fighting to leave Sri Lanka to go to Korea for employment. So as you can see, in this narrative of decline, one of the key sort of frames of reference has been the civil war and, okay, sorry. I'm sorry. Ethnicity and violence has and the politics of identity have really dominated the narrative on Sri Lanka and also the scholarship on Sri Lanka for the past several years. The preoccupation with these events, with these issues, specifically of ethnicity as the frame of reference for understanding Sri Lankan society and polity, has created a huge vacuum in the body of work on Sri Lanka with regard to other equally valid categories for analysis. So there are certain key ways in which the conflict has not been analyzed or located within the broader field of politics and complex political agendas, which I am arguing is a serious kind of lack in the way in which we've understood the Sri Lankan situation, including the violence. So there are certain key questions about the Sri Lankan polity which merits closer examination. These include the kind of push for a centralized and authoritarian government structure that we've been experiencing over the past several years, in spite of the dominance, sorry, am I still not being heard? What's covering my face? The mic, okay. And the dominance, in spite of this trend towards authoritarianism, of a social democratic welfare state as the ideal model. Despite also the fact that if you really think about how Sri Lanka has functioned over the past several years, is the dominance of the ruling elite, a ruling elite which has proved to be exceedingly enduring, both in terms of economics and political resources. So how this political elite has endured, and also this image or the model of a social democratic welfare state in the context, furthermore, of liberalization, privatization, and increasing inequalities and disparities in society. So this ideal of a social democratic welfare state has been central to the notion of how people's well-being has been mediated. Access to employment, health, education, and even personal security are mediated in this model by the state. This model has survived years or even decades of economic reforms which have included liberalization and privatization. Liberalization and privatization took place in Sri Lanka long before some of the other South Asian states. It started as far back as in 1977. So what I'm proposing here is also the fact that the other paradox that you see is how the political, what I'm suggesting is that the endurance of the political elite needs to be really closely examined in order to understand or get a better understanding of the political turmoil Sri Lanka has experienced over the past several years. For this, I need to go back into history a little bit to really look at how the political elite in Sri Lanka came into being. During the colonial period, Sri Lanka experienced rapid economic growth and a huge expansion of the plantation sector. One of the consequences of this is the emergence of a local capitalist class, primarily from the Sinhalese community, especially in coastal and low country areas. The traditional elite, which were mainly from an aristocratic subcaste within the Goigama caste, which is generally considered the highest caste within the Sinhalese community, had a privileged position during the colonial period, where they collaborated quite closely with the colonial administration in exchange for certain privileges. The emergence of a growing capitalist class, which came from within the Goigama but also other castes, proved to be a real threat to the traditional elite, who felt that, who experienced a loss of their kind of position in society, and also because of the demands of the emerging capitalist class for the same kind of privileges that the traditional elite had hitherto enjoyed, especially through their collaboration with the colonial administration. So this rivalry between the traditional elite and the emerging capitalist class had both caste as well as class elements, and also led to defining how representative institutions were developed in Sri Lanka during the transition from colonial to independent state. So for example, when the establishment of a legislative council prior to independence was an arena where this rivalry was really played out. Nomination was based on communal basis, so there was a seat for each ethnic group, and usually the nomination to the Sinhala and Tamil seats were both from particular established families. As a result, even when the colonial administration wanted to instigate more representative forms of government, this was resisted by the local elite, who felt that going in for representative government would result in a loss of their privileged position in society. So one of the consequences of this was the fact that in Sri Lanka, compared to, say, neighboring India, we did not see a mass agitation or movement for political reform. Mass mobilization happened largely on religious and ethnic grounds, such as, for example, movements like the temperance movement, which was initially by the Christian missionaries and then gradually became dominated by Sinhala Buddhists into a sort of as part of the Buddhist revival movement. The traditional elite were quick to understand the power of mass mobilization, and it led to the participation of these leaders in some of these movements, who yet were able to maintain quite a different private life. So for example, SWRD Bandaranayake, who was kind of considered to have been one of the leading movements of, leading members of the revival of Sinhala nationalism, when he was greeted by his community on his return from Oxford successfully, when there was a big ceremony, he had to welcome him back, he had to apologize to his community for being unable to speak in Sinhala. This was the man who eventually, when he became Prime Minister, campaigned for the Sinhala-only language bill, which was to result in so many other things in terms of the conflict that happened. However, whatever the sort of tension between the elite and their resistance to representative government, By 1931, Sri Lanka had universal franchise. The situation in Britain and also in the rest of the world was such that this could not be resisted, and state councils the state council replaced the legislative council, and people had to be elected to this. So this was all in place by 1948. But what is significant here is that electoral reforms in Sri Lanka were paralleled by a construction of a large social democratic welfare state. And this was largely to do with bridging the gap between the elite and the masses. So the development of the rural areas, bringing back the glories of Sri Lanka's past based on a romanticized vision of a thriving agriculture-based society, formed the basis of this vision. Rural development, provision of free health, education, public sector employment as a source of social mobility, and gradually, as majoritarian politics took hold, the primacy of the Sinhala language and protection of Buddhism became hallmarks of the independent state. What is interesting is how strongly this ideal of the state has remained despite privatization, reduced welfare, and shrinking public sector employment. No government has ever been publicly able to distance itself from this ideal model. Public sector employment is a good example of how this ideal is upheld in society and by politicians in order to stay in power. Each successive government at some point, usually close to an election, launches an employment scheme where university graduates are given employment in the public sector. These are usually hastily put together schemes, and often the new recruits do not even have a table to sit at or a space to occupy in their offices, let alone a job description. Yet, this has become a practice of each government. So unlike sort of standard understandings of the impact of neoliberal economic policies on shrinking the state, the reverse has actually happened in Sri Lanka, where the public sector remains large and actually has even grown in certain contexts. An example of how this public sector has performed and endured despite liberalization is the way in which development projects themselves have been implemented. Huge state-led development projects have been a signature of most political regimes. Many of these development projects are also linked to particular individual politicians, so that the relationship that is established between the politician and his constituency is often mediated through how these development projects have been implemented and the rituals around these development projects. So it is not just that the project itself is associated with the politician, but there are various rituals whereby the relationship is marked. So if it's a housing scheme, the politician is actually there handing out the deeds to the various people who are benefiting from the scheme. And you have sort of the best symbol for me of this is how when you're presenting these kinds of gifts to the people, the constituents would go down on their knees, touch the feet of the politician, and sort of worship the politician for his generosity and benevolence. So the fact that it is public money generated through loans or taxes that are providing these services is conveniently ignored. Instead, the distribution of resources is showcased as a mark of that particular politician's personal ingenuity, resourcefulness, power, influence, and benevolence. Global development agents are often complicit in these development rituals. This is a signboard which is close to my house, which was on a lane, at the top of the lane, which was newly carpeted. It's about 1 kilometer long, about 10 feet wide. Now this board starts off by thanking the president for his advice for carpeting the road. Then his brother, who is the secretary of the Ministry of Urban Development, is thanked for his patronage. And then finally, the grateful population thanks the mayor and the deputy mayor of my area for having built this or carpeted this 1 kilometer road. So the link between whatever the benefits that are offered and the individual politicians are constantly kind of affirmed in public. So what does this really mean? So despite the ideal of a social democratic welfare state, State-society relations in Sri Lanka are mediated through an intricate arrangement of social and political networks. This makes who you know in Sri Lanka quite critical to many aspects of your life. Your experience of the state is often directly mediated by a politician. So the more networked you are into the circles of influence, that will significantly improve your experience of the state. Every time there's a change of government in Sri Lanka, it involves a huge shift in power and influence, especially at the lower levels of the state system or the bureaucracy. There's less of a shift at the top levels, and I'll explain that in a minute, which is why ensuring that the one you know remains in power, or at least the one that you know who knows the one everybody else wants to know is in power, is quite critical for how people experience the state. Of course, this has not been unchallenged, and if you look at the sort of history of Sri Lanka's youth insurrections, as suggested by Jayadeva Uyangoda, these were more in the nature of counter-state movements rather than anti-state, because what was really being attempted, as he argues, is not to overthrow the state, but to actually establish a state that was more to your liking, so that those who were excluded from the previous state would have better access through a new kind of state mechanism. The Presidential Commission, which was established in 1990 after one of the most brutal and violent periods in Sri Lanka's history, recorded the narratives of thousands of young people who said their main problem with the system was the politicization of the public sector, especially of employment opportunities. More recently, a youth survey conducted in 2013 where youth identified that political connections was the primary criteria for employment in the public sector and social connections in the private sector. So an aspect that has gone relatively unexamined in Sri Lanka is the degree to which the ruling elite have managed to keep control of both power and resources in Sri Lanka. 1956 was supposed to be the turning point when our government, it was called Apeandua, the government of the people, came into power. And the sort of rural elite that pushed that government into power was supposed to have eroded the power base of the traditional elite. But what is really interesting is how invisible this rural elite have actually become, and the endurance of the traditional elite who have managed to ensure that they've kept themselves going despite the so-called revolution in 1956. And it's interesting to note that much of the violence, especially initially, even in the north and east, how much there was resonance between what was going on in what was often described as the ethnic conflict and the youth insurrections in the south, where, in a way, both groups were fighting for a different kind of state. So it is also interesting to note that actually the two presidents who've been accused of authoritarianism the most are actually politicians who came from somewhat outside of this the traditional elite system. Where President Premadasa from the United National Party, who was the second president, had to take on and defeat the sort of family network that had kept the UNP in power for the longest time. President Rajapaksa also had to face considerable opposition from within the party in order to get to the leadership of the People's Alliance, and prides himself on being somewhat outside of the kind of usual cosmopolitan, English-speaking, urbanized political elite. Yet, once they reach the position of leadership, both leaders focus strongly on projecting themselves and their families while in power, establishing a new network of politically influential elites. It's also interesting the way in which the expanding Sinhala Buddhist middle class has been part of this new emerging elite. It is interesting that President Rajapaksa's support base, which is strongly Sinhala Buddhist, and how we have witnessed in more recent times a resurgence of Sinhala nationalist politics, particularly among Buddhist monks. Yet, to construe Sri Lankan Sinhala Buddhist nationalism as one homogeneous category would also be a mistake. For instance, within the opposition to the presidential system that is currently emerging. From within the president's alliance, there's one priest-led, Buddhist monk-led group which is campaigning actively for the abolishing of the presidential system. So in a way, the way in which the current debates have been unfolding in the next few weeks, or will continue to unfold in the next few weeks and months, will, I think, quite significantly shape the trajectory of Sri Lanka's polity for the next several years. There are several forces at work here. The democratic impulse generated through many years of representative government, which cannot be suppressed. A renewal of ethno-religious nationalism, especially from within the majority community. Tensions between the centralization of power and the push for electoral reform, and a growing sense of exclusion from the resources of the state. Which of these forces will triumph or have more influence remains to be seen. What is of no doubt is that these tensions and take shape and influence events in the coming weeks and months will have a tremendous impact on the shape of Sri Lanka's future political structures, especially in terms of its democratic features. Thank you very much.